We teach people to live by a guiding question. We say it's just simple to ask, what does love require of me in this situation? Gentlemen, welcome, and if you're not a guy and you're watching this, this is okay, but this is a video specifically designed for our men, mentoring men's ministry. This would be kind of our introduction video. So gentlemen, welcome. We're glad you're here, and let me just say thank you for joining us and having the courage to recognize that, hey, I need something more in life, and maybe if there is a God, that's where I find the answers. In fact, that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So a friend of mine was talking to me and telling me about his car. And he was saying when they were younger, they bought this car. They didn't have much money. And so they bought like a $3,000 car, right? And they're driving this $3,000 car. And one of the things they didn't know was that the little light that tells you there's an engine problem, the little bulb that used to be in the cars, went bad. And so he says his wife's driving the car and they're barely making it by financially. They're struggling. That's what young people do, right? And he says one day he gets a call from his wife. She's stranded on the side of the road. And he goes and they get it towed and they find out, hey, it's another like $3,000 to get this engine redone and rebuilt. And the reason that the car broke down was because of a 30-cent bulb. The 30-cent bulb is on your dashboard, right? And it has a little warning. It says, hey, the engine's overheating or there's not enough oil. Something's not right. What I'd like to suggest to you is one of the reasons that we have a men's group and that you should be part of a men's group. And if you're doing this at your own church and using our curriculum, great. But one of the reasons why you want to be part of a men's group is because what? Well, it's because you recognize I cannot and should not do life alone. In fact, maybe what you've recognized is that there's something incomplete. And I would like to suggest to you that the first step in becoming a godly man and doing life the way God wants it to is to step back and say, I need you, Jesus. Put it to you this way. I want you to think through the gauges of your life, if you will. Just imagine your life as a dashboard. Here's your gauges. What gauges would you use to define success? Maybe you have a work gauge. It's going up and down, right? And you have a relationship gauge with friends. You see it going up and down. You have a family gauge. If you're married, your spouse is top priority, and then your kids, and you have that gauge. If you're single, again, it's kind of your parents and brothers and sisters. And then maybe you have a financial gauge, right? Because that causes stress and causes all other parts of your life to shut down if that gets into a crisis. What happens when all those gauges seem to be doing well, or maybe they're all flashing at you because you're missing one important gauge? Is it possible that work can be going well, your relationships well, your family well, your finances well, and yet you stop and you realize, as many have over and over through the centuries, but I'm still missing something? Think about it. We know, like, millionaires. We know people who are big movie stars and sports athletes who have everything on the outside. All those gauges would look perfect. And we know that some of them have the most miserable lives. Because there's another gauge which actually defines success in your life. That gauge is your relationship with Jesus. The ability for us to recognize, I don't have all the answers. I can't do it on my own. Now the irony here is that I really don't need to convince any of us guys that. Because we run with a huge fear of failure. And we feel the weight of our families on our shoulders. The need to be tough, the need to be able to handle it all, the need to be able to say nothing affects me, nothing impacts me. We're going to be able to get through it. But deep down inside, there's this fear we really can't do it on our own. We really need something bigger, something more. Because we've all encountered a situation we couldn't handle on our own. I remember I was getting ready to change the brake lines in my Suburban. We were young and just kind of making it by again financially, like my first story. And I took the car to a shop and they said, your brake lines are out. And I said, wow, okay, how much does that cost? And they're like, hey, it's going to be, $700, $800. And I thought, No way we had. I mean, it could have been like $9,000 at that point in time in our life. And a buddy of mine was like, hey, you can do this on your own. It'll cost you like $50, which sounded like a great idea. Now, this is how old I am. Back then, you had to go to the library and get a book that told you how to do this. So I went to the library, got a book, I read up on it, I went and bought brake lines, and began to put it all together. My buddy who said, you can do this, calls me up and is like, hey, when are you doing that? And I told him, and so I'm underneath the car, I'm covered in brake fluid, I'm covered in gunk, and he stops by and I see his feet as I'm just finishing up. And I kind of scoot out, and he says, how you doing? I go, I think I'm done. And I was really excited because I thought I'd kind of done it on my own, and I was so excited about all the money I saved. And he goes, well, did you bleed the brake lines? And I went, I have no idea what you mean. I'm bleeding because I cut my arm. Is that what you mean? He goes, no, you have to bleed the brake lines. Now, I had no idea what that meant. And come to find out, there could have been some serious consequences. And what he said to me was, can I help you? Now, at that moment, I was very self-aware that while I was really happy and excited I was able to do this job, I suddenly was also aware that I didn't do it quite right. You see, I think that's where most guys are. Most guys are like, I'm doing the best I can, and we're still not getting it quite right. Why? Well, there's another gauge that should be on your dashboard, and that's your relationship with Jesus. In fact, that gauge is the most important gauge because that gauge affects your marriage. You want to know why your marriage is struggling? Well, it's because you haven't surrendered completely to Jesus and behaved in your marriage the way you want to. Or maybe your spouse hasn't surrendered to Jesus and the two of you are in conflict in that gauge. But it all comes back to your relationship gauge with Jesus. Hey, your finances, again, until we learn to handle money biblically the way God does and budget, we never really get that gauge right. And that gauge impacts all our relationships. Because when do you stop forgiving your friend? Well, Jesus says never, but he also doesn't say let him walk all over you. He says put in healthy boundaries. Again, Jesus determines how all the other gauges and how everything else in the system works. And so the most important thing that you could do is to pause right now and say, if there is a God, I bet he created me with intent and design. And what does that God want from me? What did he create me to be into? I would argue that God created you to be in relationship with him. Now, this isn't the part where men get all huggy and mushy and smushy. No, but what does it mean to be in a relationship with God? To say that Jesus calls men to do difficult things. To say that Jesus calls men to tackle giants. To say that Jesus calls men to live sacrificially in submission to their wives. To say that Jesus calls us to rise up and raise our family in such a way that we take on lions on a regular basis. To say that Jesus calls men to do difficult things. This is what Jesus has said. He said, come follow me. You may not have a home. We may be out in the wilderness. But if you follow me, you'll get the greatest reward. And so today, I invite you to just examine your life for a moment. To slow down. Maybe some of us just need to stop and go, all right, let me think about it. And ask the question, do you really do life well on your own when you're in charge? Or would it be better to have somebody else be the king of your life? Because that makes sense. Because it coincides with reality. Because God is real. He did create you. And he wants to be in charge of your life. You see, the first step to discipleship is saying, Jesus, I want you to be in charge.